Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases of frontier brutality in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge your understanding of human nature in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that unfolded in the isolated wilderness of Alaska, where a simple trading post became the site of unspeakable horror, and where greed and desperation transformed ordinary men into monsters whose crimes would shock even the hardened prospectors of the last frontier. It was the year 1943. World War II was consuming the globe, millions of young men were fighting overseas, and America's attention was focused thousands of miles away on European and Pacific battlefields. In the remote territories of Alaska, however, a different kind of darkness was unfolding, one that would reveal how quickly civilization's veneer could crack when isolation, greed, and opportunity converged in the frozen wilderness. Alaska in the 1940s was not the state we know today. It wouldn't achieve statehood for another 16 years. This was a vast, largely unmapped territory where entire communities could exist beyond the reach of law and order, where winter darkness lasted for months, and where the nearest law enforcement officer might be hundreds of miles away across treacherous terrain. It was a land of prospectors and trappers, of indigenous peoples whose ancestors had survived here for millennia, and of trading posts that served as the only connection between wilderness and civilization. These trading posts were more than simple stores. They were banks, post offices, social centers, and lifelines. A good trading post operator held the trust of everyone in the region, indigenous hunters bringing in furs, white trappers stocking up on supplies, prospectors cashing in their gold dust. Trust was currency in these remote outposts, as vital as the goods on the shelves. And when that trust was betrayed, the consequences rippled through the wilderness like cracks spreading across frozen ice. The Yukon River country of interior Alaska is a landscape that defies easy description. Imagine, if you will, a world where spruce forests stretch endlessly in every direction, broken only by the silver threads of countless rivers and streams, where temperatures in winter plunge to 60 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, to make metal brittle, to turn your breath into ice crystals that hang in the air like suspended time. In summer, the land transforms permafrost thaws into boggy muskeg. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds so thick they can drive men mad, and the sun barely sets, creating an endless twilight that disorients newcomers and exhausts the sleep-deprived. This is a country that tests every person who enters it, that sorts the strong from the weak with brutal efficiency. There, along a bend in the Yukon River, approximately 300 miles west of Fairbanks, sat a trading post that had operated for nearly 2 decades. The log structure was weathered but solid, its windows glazed against the cold, its storerooms stocked with everything necessary for survival in the bush: flour and tea, traps and ammunition, tobacco and medicine, needles and thread. The proprietor of this establishment was a man named George, a name we'll use though records show various spellings and possibly aliases. George was in his early 50s, weathered by decades in the north, with the lean build of someone who'd spent years moving through difficult country. He had a reputation for fair dealing, for extending credit when times were hard, for paying honest prices for furs and gold. Native families trusted him, white trappers respected him. His trading post was neutral ground in a vast territory where such places were rare and precious. George lived at the post with his wife, a Koyukon Athabascan woman named Mary, whose family had lived along the Yukon for countless generations. Mary was more than George's wife. She was his interpreter, his connection to the indigenous community, his partner in the delicate social navigation required to run a successful trading post. Together, they had built something valuable in that harsh landscape, a place of safety and commerce, a point of light in the immense darkness. Their typical customers were an interesting cross-section of Alaska's population. There was old John, a trapper in his 70s who'd been working these territories since before the gold rush. There were the Damasky brothers, young indigenous hunters who brought in the finest lynx and marten pelts. There was a rotating cast of prospectors, always optimistic, always convinced that the next creek would yield the strike that would make them rich. And then there were the newcomers, the men drawn north by wartime opportunities and rumors of easy money in a land where the normal rules didn't apply. In the autumn of 1943, 2 such men arrived at George's trading post. Their names were Jack and William again, names that may or may not have been their real ones, as the frontier attracted men running from pasts they preferred to forget. Jack was the older of the 2, perhaps 40, with the calculating eyes of someone always measuring angles and opportunities. William was younger, mid-20s, with the nervous energy of someone both ambitious and uncertain. They told George they were prospectors, heading up river to work some claims before winter closed in. They needed supplies, standard equipment, nothing unusual. George sold them what they requested, extended them credit as he would for any customer who seemed legitimate, and thought little more about it. He had no way of knowing that he'd just met his murderers. The first snow came early that year, arriving in late September with a vengeance that suggested the winter would be particularly brutal. By mid-October, the Yukon was beginning to freeze, that dangerous period when the ice isn't yet solid enough to cross but thick enough to make river travel treacherous. It was during this transitional period that George and Mary disappeared. The disappearance wasn't immediately noticed. Such was the nature of life in the bush. People came and went. Sometimes a trading post operator would travel to Fairbanks for supplies, a journey that could take weeks. Sometimes they'd visit native fish camps or travel to check on trappers working distant territories. But when November arrived and the trading post remained closed, when smoke no longer rose from its chimney and the door stayed barred, questions began to circulate through the sparse network of wilderness inhabitants. Old John was the first to investigate. He'd come down from his trap line expecting to trade his earlists, and furs for supplies before the deep winter set in. Finding the post closed was disturbing. Finding it locked was alarming. Finding George's sled dogs still in their pen, half-starved and desperate, was terrifying. John broke into the trading post through a window. Inside, he found chaos. The store had been ransacked. Goods were scattered across the floor. The cash box had been pried open and emptied. Most telling, George's carefully maintained account books, which recorded every transaction, every debt owed and owed to him, were missing. These books represented hundreds of dollars in accounts receivable, in gold dust and furs promised but not yet delivered. For a trading post operator, these books were nearly as valuable as the inventory itself. But of George and Mary themselves, there was no sign. John searched the building thoroughly, his sense of dread growing with each empty room. The couple's personal quarters showed signs of hasty departure or forced removal. Mary's sewing sat unfinished. George's rifle, which he never traveled without, remained on its rack. Most disturbing was the silence, the complete, absolute silence of a place where voices had recently fallen quiet. Old John knew he couldn't handle this alone. He loaded his sled with enough supplies to survive the journey and set out for the nearest settlement that had a U.S. Marshal or territorial police presence, a journey that would take him 4 days through increasingly hostile weather. When he finally reached civilization and reported what he'd found, authorities faced a familiar problem: jurisdiction and logistics in a territory where both were nightmares. The trading post was hundreds of miles from the nearest marshal's office. Winter was closing in rapidly. Organizing an investigation would require resources, personnel, and transportation that were in short supply with the war effort consuming national attention. But the disappearance of a trading post operator was serious business. It wasn't just about two missing people. It was about the fragile infrastructure of trust that held frontier society together. If traders couldn't operate safely, if the few commercial centers in the wilderness could be attacked with impunity, the entire region's social fabric would unravel. Deputy Marshal Thomas Warrens was assigned to investigate. Warrens was in his mid-40s, a career lawman who'd spent 20 years working in Alaska's remote regions. He'd investigated everything from claim, jumping disputes to bootlegging operations to the occasional murder. He was methodical, patient, and accustomed to working in conditions that would defeat less experienced officers. Warrens assembled a small team: a native guide named Peter who knew the river country intimately, a physician's assistant named Robert who could document medical evidence, and two deputies who could help with the physical labor of searching vast terrain in winter conditions. They reached the trading post in early December, traveling by dog sled over ice that had finally frozen solid. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero. Daylight lasted perhaps 4 hours. This was the deep winter that tests everything living. Warrens's investigation began with the systematic documentation that separated professional law enforcement from frontier justice. He photographed the ransacked store. He cataloged what was missing, not just the cash and account books, but specific hive-value items, several gold pokes that trappers had left for safekeeping, a collection of valuable furs waiting to be shipped to market, ammunition, and, ironically, George's best winter gear. The pattern suggested robbery, but the missing persons element was what troubled Warrens most. Bodies weren't something you could easily hide in Alaska. The frozen ground made burial nearly impossible. Rivers were freezing. The wilderness itself would preserve remains almost indefinitely in winter temperatures. So where were George and Mary? Peter, the native guide, provided the answer through traditional tracking methods that transcended the limitations of Western investigation. He examined the ground around the trading post, reading stories in compressed snow and disturbed vegetation that others couldn't see. He found evidence of a struggle near the dog pen. He found drag marks leading toward the river, partially obscured by subsequent snowfall, but still visible to trained eyes. And he found something else: fresh blaze marks on trees along a trail heading upriver. These marks were recent, made after the first snow, indicating someone had been navigating this route recently enough that they'd needed to mark their way. Someone came here, Peter told Warrens, gesturing along the marked trail, took things, went that direction. He pointed upriver, toward the claims that Jack and William had mentioned they were working. Warrens made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than pursuing immediately, he would first search the immediate area thoroughly. Bodies hidden nearby would provide crucial evidence, and if the perpetrators were upriver at their claims, they weren't going anywhere. Winter had locked them in as effectively as any jail cell. The search focused on the area around the trading post, expanding in careful grids. They checked every outbuilding, every cache, every natural shelter where bodies might be concealed. It was Robert, the physician's assistant, who found the first evidence. Behind a storage shed, partially concealed under a tarp and covered with snow, were bloodstains. A lot of blood, frozen now into dark ice that spoke of violence and death. the blood trail led to the river. In summer, the Yukon runs fast and deep. Its gray, brown waters carrying glacial silt and the drainage from a watershed the size of Texas. In winter, it becomes a highway of ice, a frozen road through the wilderness. But between those seasons, during freeze-up, the river is treacherous. Ice forms in plates and sheets, jamming against itself, creating unstable surfaces that can give way without warning. It was during this period that George and Mary had disappeared. Peter understood immediately what had happened. The blood, the drag marks, the timing. It all pointed to a grim conclusion that Warrens was reaching as well. They used the river, Peter said quietly, crouching near the blood-stained snow. Bodies go under ice during freeze, up, river takes them, current pushes them under solid ice, maybe never found. It was a murder method that showed both local knowledge and brutal practicality. During freeze-up, a body placed in the river would be swept under forming ice, carried downstream by the current, trapped in the frozen labyrinth beneath the surface. The river became both weapon and accomplice, concealing evidence that might not surface literally until spring breakup months later, if ever. But the murderers had made mistakes. The blood trail was one. The ransacked trading post was another. And the blazed trail leading upriver was a third, a sign of arrogance or incompetence that would prove fatal to their freedom. Warrens knew he now had enough evidence to move against suspects, even without bodies. The territorial courts had convicted murderers on circumstantial evidence before, particularly when that evidence was as compelling as what they'd found here. "We go upriver," Warrens announced, carefully. "These men have already killed twice. They're armed, isolated, and have nothing to lose." The journey took 3 days. They traveled by dog sled, following Peter's navigation and the blazed trail markers that Jack and William had foolishly left behind. The temperature dropped to 45 below zero. Exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes at that temperature. Every action required deliberate care. Removing a glove to handle a gun could cost you fingers. The cabin they finally located sat in a small clearing about 70 miles upriver from the trading post. Smoke rose from its chimney, a thin gray column in the Arctic air that signaled human habitation in the vast emptiness. Warrens's approach was methodical. He positioned his 2 deputies in cover positions with clear sight lines to the cabin's door and windows. He instructed them to shoot if necessary, but only if necessary. He wanted these men alive for trial, for justice, for closure. Then he and Peter approached the cabin directly, making enough noise to announce their presence, but keeping weapons ready. "Jack, William," Warrens shouted from 30 yards out. "This is Deputy Marshal Warrens. Come out with your hands visible." The silence that followed stretched like wire being drawn tight. Then the cabin door cracked open. Jack emerged first, and what struck Warrens immediately was the man's clothing. Jack was wearing George's distinctive fur parka, the one with the unique pattern of wolf and wolverine fur that everyone in the region would recognize. It was a mistake born of either arrogance or stupidity, wearing your victim's clothing like a trophy. "What's this about, Marshal?" Jack called out, his voice carrying false confidence across the frozen air. "Where's George and Mary from the trading post?" Warrens responded. "How should we know? We've been up here working our claims since October. Haven't seen anyone." "Then why are you wearing George's parka?" The question hung in the cold air like an executioner's blade. Jack's hand moved toward his belt, where a pistol was visible. Behind Warrens, he heard the unmistakable sound of his deputies cocking their rifles. "Don't," Warrens said quietly. "You're already done. Don't make it worse." The mathematics of the situation were clear. Jack was outnumbered and outpositioned. Any move toward his weapon would result in multiple rifle bullets from protected positions. His shoulders slumped. "William," Jack called back toward the cabin, "come out, it's over." The younger man emerged, and his face told the entire story. Where Jack showed calculation and defeat, William showed relief. The relief of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable burden and could finally set it down. The arrest was anticlimactic after the tension of the approach. Both men were disarmed and restrained. Warrens's search of the cabin revealed evidence that removed any lingering doubt. George's account books, carefully stacked in a corner. Multiple gold pokes with various names on them. Furs that had been in the trading post's inventory. And most damning, Mary's distinctive beaded bag, one she'd made herself and carried constantly. That night, secured in the cabin with deputies standing guard, William began to talk. The confession came slowly at first, then faster as William seemed desperate to unburden himself of the weight he'd been carrying. Jack sat silently, his face stone, but he didn't interrupt or contradict, perhaps recognizing that silence was his only remaining strategy. According to William's account, the plan had been Jack's from the beginning. They'd never been legitimate prospectors. They'd come north specifically to rob isolated trading posts, targeting establishments far enough from civilization that law enforcement response would be delayed. They'd watched George's trading post for days, studying the patterns, waiting for the right opportunity. They'd noted that George kept gold dust and furs for his customers, acting as an informal bank. They'd seen the account books and understood their value. And they'd known that freeze-up was approaching, offering a natural method for disposing of evidence. On the night of October 23, 1943, they'd returned to the trading post claiming they needed emergency supplies. George, ever the accommodating trader, had let them in despite the late hour. What happened next, William described in a voice that occasionally broke with emotion. They'd pulled weapons. They'd demanded gold, cash, and the account books. George had resisted not violently, but with the kind of quiet defiance that comes from a lifetime of facing down hard situations. Jack had struck George with a rifle butt, dropping him to the floor. Mary had screamed. Jack had shot her to silence her, the bullet taking her in the chest, killing her almost instantly. George, wounded but conscious, had watched his wife die. Then Jack had shot him as well. They'd ransacked the trading post methodically, taking everything valuable enough to carry and light enough to transport. They'd loaded their sled with the stolen goods, and then came the disposal of the bodies. Working in darkness, they'd dragged George and Mary's bodies to the river. The ice was forming, but not yet solid. They'd pushed the bodies into the current at a point where plates of ice were jamming together, watched them slip under, watched the river take them. Then they'd return to clean the blood as best they could, to cover their tracks, to mark a trail to their cabin, confident that the winter isolation would protect them until spring, when they could slip away to civilization with their stolen wealth. Why not just rob them? Warrens asked. Why kill them? William looked at him with hollow eyes. Jack said they'd identify us. Said in a place like this, everyone knows everyone. Said dead witnesses don't testify. Jack's expression never changed throughout this recitation. He stared at the wall, his face revealing nothing. The journey back to Fairbanks took a week, traveling with prisoners in winter conditions. By the time they arrived, word of the arrests had already spread through the territory's communication network's radio broadcasts, bush pilots spreading news at each stop, the informal gossip network that connected Alaska's scattered population. The trial, held in early 1944, drew unusual attention for territorial Alaska. The courtroom in Fairbanks was packed with trappers, traders, native community members, and prospectors who'd traveled considerable distances to witness justice for one of their own. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Warrens testified about the investigation, the evidence found at the trading post and at the cabin, the blood trail, and the stolen property. Peter described the tracking evidence and his understanding of what had happened to the bodies. Old John testified about discovering the abandoned trading post and the starving dogs. Multiple witnesses identified George's distinctive parka on Jack's back, Mary's beaded bag, the stolen furs and gold. And William testified for the prosecution, having agreed to give evidence against Jack in exchange for a life sentence rather than hanging. His testimony was detailed, damning, and clearly truthful. He knew details about the crime scene that only someone present could have known. Jack's defense attorney, appointed by the territorial court, had little to work with. He argued for manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, claiming the deaths had occurred in the heat of a robbery gone wrong. He emphasized the harsh conditions of Alaska, the desperation that drove men to extreme acts, the lack of direct witnesses to contradict his client's claim that William had fired the fatal shots. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder for both victims. The judge, showing no mercy for crimes that struck at the heart of Alaska's frontier society, sentenced Jack to death by hanging. The execution took place on August 9, 1944, at the territorial prison in what was a relatively rare event. Alaska conducted only a handful of official executions throughout its territorial period. Jack went to the gallows maintaining his silence, offering no final words, no confession, no apology to the families and communities he'd devastated. William served his life sentence at various facilities, eventually being transferred to a federal prison in the lower 48 after Alaska achieved statehood. According to records, he maintained exemplary behavior in prison, seeking repeatedly to express remorse for his actions. He died in custody in 1978, having served 34 years behind bars. But the story's impact reached far beyond the courtroom and the prison walls. The trading post on the Yukon remained closed for months after the murders, a dark monument to violated trust. Eventually, it was taken over by a new operator, but the building itself carried a shadow that never quite lifted. Local people reported feeling uneasy there, particularly indigenous visitors who'd known Mary and George. The place that had once been a center of community became something else, a reminder of how quickly safety could transform into danger. The bodies of George and Mary were never recovered. The Yukon River kept its secrets, as it has kept countless others throughout history. When spring breakup came in April of 1944, people watched the ice flow past, wondering if the melting flows carried the remains of the murdered couple. Some trappers claimed they glimpsed something caught in an ice jam 40 miles downstream, something that might have been human. But by the time anyone could investigate, the river had reclaimed whatever it had briefly revealed. For Mary's family, the loss was particularly profound. They conducted traditional ceremonies without bodies to guide to the next world, performing rituals as best they could for spirits that might still be lost in the river that had been their home. The Koyukon Athabascan peoples have protocols for death and remembrance, ceremonies that help the living release the dead and help the dead find their way forward. But these ceremonies are complicated when there's no physical presence to anchor them, when the deceased remain missing in the liminal space between life and confirmed death. The case reinforced what frontier communities had always known but sometimes forgot. Isolation was both freedom and vulnerability. In places far from law enforcement, People relied on shared social codes, on reputation and mutual respect. When those codes were violated, when trust was weaponized by predators who saw isolation as opportunity rather than mutual vulnerability, the entire social fabric was threatened. Trading posts became more cautious after the murders. Many operators installed additional security measures, bars on windows, reinforced doors, weapons kept more readily accessible. Some began requiring that strangers provide references or be vouched for by known community members before receiving credit or being allowed inside after dark. The easy hospitality that had characterized the frontier began to calcify into wariness, and yet the wilderness endures, as it always has. The Yukon River continues its ancient flow from Canadian headwaters to the Bering Sea. The spruce forests still shelter trappers and wildlife. The trading posts, those that remain, still serve their essential functions, though their numbers have dwindled as Alaska modernized, as bush planes made travel easier, as online ordering reached even remote communities. The story of George and Mary's murders remains a cautionary tale told in cabins and around campfires throughout interior Alaska. It's invoked when discussing the nature of frontier justice, when debating the death penalty, when considering what happens when greed meets opportunity in isolation. Old-timers still remember hearing about it, still recall the impact it had on their community's sense of security. There's a particular kind of darkness in murders that occur in vast landscapes, a contrast between the immensity of nature and the smallness of human evil. George and Mary died in a place of spectacular beauty, where the northern lights dance green and purple across winter skies, where the midnight sun bathes the land in eternal golden twilight, where the river they loved and lived beside ultimately became their unmarked grave. Questions persist, as they always do in cases where not every detail can be recovered. Did George and Mary suffer before their deaths, or was it mercifully quick? Were there other victims that Jack and William left in their wake as they moved through Alaska's wilderness? What happened to the stolen gold? Did authorities recover all of it, or did some remain hidden in the vast landscape? And most haunting, do George and Mary's remains still lie somewhere in the Yukon River's depths, trapped in sediment and ice, or did the spring flood of 1944 carry them all the way to the sea? The trading post where they died was eventually torn down in the 1970s, replaced by nothing. The site returned to wilderness, trees growing where the store once stood, the forest reclaiming what had briefly been civilization. But people who visit that bend in the river still report feeling watched, still experience the prickling awareness that comes from standing on ground where violence occurred. Whether this is psychological projection or something more, who can say? The wilderness keeps its secrets better than any vault. What remains undeniable is this: the murders of George and Mary reveal a fundamental truth about human nature that time and progress cannot erase. We carry within us the capacity for both tremendous kindness and shocking cruelty. In frontier societies, these capacities exist in closer proximity, with fewer barriers between impulse and action. The thin veneer of civilization that prevents us from acting on our darkest thoughts is maintained not by laws alone but by community, by mutual vulnerability, by the knowledge that we are seen and will be held accountable. Jack and William believed that distance from civilization gave them immunity from consequences. They underestimated the frontier's own form of justice, the network of witnesses and trackers, and determined lawmen who would pursue them through the harshest conditions on earth. They forgot that in isolated places, every action has witnesses. The land itself, the patterns left in snow, the blood that stains ice, the stolen property that testifies to crimes committed. The Untold Hour has brought you this journey through darkness, not to sensationalize violence, but to remember those who died, to honor the investigators who sought justice in impossible conditions, and to reflect on the choices that define us as individuals and as communities. If this journey through Alaska's frozen wilderness and the shadows of human greed has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fragility of trust in isolated places and the persistence of justice even in the harshest conditions, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the respect and depth they warrant. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it reminded you that behind every historical crime are real people whose lives were cut short and communities that were forever changed. Comment sharing your thoughts on frontier justice, on the nature of isolation, or on the thin line between civilization and chaos that we all navigate daily. And remember George and Mary, the trading post operators who opened their door on a dark October night to men they tried to help, only to be betrayed by the worst impulses of human nature. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their story deserves to be remembered. Until next time, may you walk safely through whatever wilderness you traverse, and may you never forget that the darkest places aren't in the landscape around us, they're in the human heart when unchecked by compassion, community, and conscience.